I'm increasingly worried about the international environment. And so I wanted to pass on what lessons I could as we enter a new Cold War with China and Russia to future generation of operators and strategists so they can win.
Hello and welcome to Washington Post Live. I'm David Ignatius, a columnist at the Post. Today I'm joined by Michael Vickers, who's had a remarkable career stretching from being a Green Beret to a CIA officer to a senior Pentagon official. He's written a quite extraordinary new memoir called By All Means Available, which is one of the best Cold War memoirs of its kind that I've read. We'll get to the book in a minute. First, welcome, Mike. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, David. Pleasure to be with you.
So, as I said, we'll dig into the book in a minute, but I want to start with some today questions on the news, if I can, which are related to many of the themes that are in this book, but come out of President Biden's visit tomorrow to the NATO summit at Vilnius and the war that's taking place in Ukraine between Ukrainian and Russian forces. I want to ask you to begin by going to something you say in your book powerfully, which is that in any engagement of American forces, it's important to have a strategy to win. You underline that in different places, thinking about Afghanistan, combating the Soviets there, many other instances. So let me ask you bluntly and directly, do you think we have a strategy to win in Ukraine?
I hope so, and I think we're on that path. But there's a difference between saying we'll support them as long as it takes and that we really want to win. And one of the things that you see in very, very successful campaigns and wars is that we achieve a form of escalation dominance. That is, we up to a certain level, at the tactical level, conventional level, we out-escalate our adversaries. We did that in Afghanistan in the 1980s. We did that against Al-Qaeda with our drone campaigns, where they didn't really have a good response. And we've held back some things in both scale and the speed with which we've delivered in Ukraine, delivered a lot of capability to them, but there's things, fighter aircraft, long-range surface-to-surface missiles. I was very pleased by the recent decision to see the cluster munitions provided. I thought that was a great decision by President Biden. But I sure hope we're in it to win it.
So we seem sometimes to have the opposite of escalation dominance, namely escalation anxiety. We every time the Russians make a statement about possible use of tactical nuclear weapons or some other euphemism, there are shudders almost audible in Washington. Do you think that we are needlessly worried about escalation and thereby giving the adversary here that dominance and control of the strategic situation?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, against a nuclear-equipped state, you have to take the threat of escalation seriously, of course. But it's something we dealt with in the Cold War, should, God forbid, general war have ever come, that you would have to deal with those threats. And the great value for the Russians, as you've seen in Ukraine, is to threaten the use of these weapons rather than actually use them, which would be of marginal utility and tactically and have a lot of downsides strategically. And so I do think we've ceded some escalation dominance to the Russians, but as we've learned, we've upped the ante, and I hope we continue on that path.
And I'm going to put to you directly the question that people often put to me, Mike. Is the administration being too timid in Ukraine?
Well, timid may be too strong a word, but I think it has been reluctant to escalate in time or in sufficient scale, but it's eventually got there. The administration has generally done the right thing. It's just done it too slowly and at perhaps not enough scale.
So, as you know, tomorrow the summit will open in Vilnius, Lithuania. One of the issues that will be up for discussion, although not really up for decision, is Ukrainian membership in NATO. I think most people recognize that immediate membership simply isn't possible for a country that's at war with Russia. But what do you think about the proposal that the Baltic states and Poland make for a strict and clear timetable? Is that a good idea?
Well, the general idea that you're going to need security guarantees to deter future aggression, I think, is right, and that we provide a pathway for Ukraine after the war is ended, hopefully, of course, on their terms, it is critically important. Whether a strict timetable is wise or not, I'm not sure, because when the war will end is still uncertain. But they have to meet the conditions. But if any state now, a European state, deserves NATO membership, it would seem to be Ukraine.
One more today news question, if you will. You spent the early part of your career thinking about waging war in the shadows, waging war against Russia, and preparing for that through NATO. One extraordinary thing that's happened in NATO over the past year is that Finland has joined the alliance, and Sweden seems at the gates. I was reassured last Friday by National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan that that's just a question of time. So we'll assume that that's going to happen. So I want to ask you from a tactical standpoint, from that kind of special forces perspective that you have, what difference will it make if we have Sweden and Finland in NATO in terms of operational capabilities, in terms of intelligence opportunities and dangers? Just think out loud for a minute about what that actually means in terms of on-the-ground military intelligence.
Sure. We'll both have very good militaries and good intelligence capabilities. And of course, Finland has a long border with the Russian Federation. And so, it was part of Putin's major strategic blunder to invade Ukraine to trigger this now. And so the northern flank of NATO is strengthened substantially in the Baltic states, the Baltic Sea, Poland, et cetera. During the Cold War, we worried a lot about a Soviet invasion of Norway. And that would be much more difficult now for lots of reasons for the Russians. And so it's a substantial strengthening of NATO, I think, to have Finland and Sweden in.
And if the price for getting Sweden approved by the Erdogan government in Turkey was giving Turkey F-16s, is it worth it?
Yeah, I think the F-16s are worth it. Now, Erdogan has also raised the issue of EU membership, which Turkey has wanted for some time and has been denied. And so that's a separate problem that I think has to be dealt with by the European Union. But, NATO will be stronger with Sweden and stronger to have Turkey fully engaged in NATO.
Let's turn to this terrific book. Some of the most vivid passages are about your early days, 10 years you spent as a Green Beret in Army Special Forces. One passage that especially struck me, forgive me, I'm going to quote here, "My favorite part of the room clearing training was diving headfirst through a window and coming up shooting." And I try to think, what person do I know in Washington who could write that sentence and probably actually mean it? There's another part of the book, Mike, where you have an absolutely hair-raising description of free fall parachuting when one of your colleagues mispacked your parachute. So I say this just so the audience will know, this is the real deal. Somebody says in your book that you sure don't look like James Bond, words to that effect, but you actually were. And I want to ask you just to share with our viewers a little bit about what it's like to actually be in these lethal, hair trigger situations where you're in free fall parachute fall and you're tumbling around and your chute it doesn't seem to be packed right. Just talk about the real life of Mike Vickers.
Sure. So the first passage you mentioned, I was on a training course with the British Special Air Service in the late 1970s, and they were quite ahead of us in counterterrorism training. And so we sent our operators to them to learn these techniques. And one of them, at first I didn't believe we could do it, was to dive through a window and come up shooting. But, it worked, or at least it seemed like a good idea when I was 24 years old. I'm not sure it looks so good anymore. And then, free fall parachuting is serious business. And, most of the time it goes right, but you can have accidents. We lose operators to this day from that. And I did have a rucksack, actually. It wasn't the parachute that was packed lopsided. It was to learn how to jump with rucksacks and weapons. And half of the sandbag inside the rucksack to give it 40 pounds of weight was bulging out of one side. And I knew this would be a problem, but my instructor said it would be fine. And I went into a violent spin for about 8,000 feet and finally stabilized myself on my back, and then thought, I can't stay this way. I got to flip over. So I managed to do that, got stable by contorting my body like Houdini. And then when I landed safely on the ground, repacked that darn rucksack.
And did you repack the guy who'd done the packing in the first place? I was left wondering what happened to that gentleman.
Nothing happened. I survived. Had something happened to me, I think he might have been investigated, but it's a good lesson about don't take chances with things. I brought it to his attention and he said, "Oh, you'll be fine." He was an instructor and I wanted to pass the course, so I didn't say much. I knew I'd solved the problem and survived, but might have been a mistake on my part.
So you're obviously somebody who is familiar with guns, weapons. You've used them in war. It's just been a part of your life through your career. I want to ask you what may seem like an unusual question, but what do you personally think about people who have AR-15s, the civilian knockoff of the military assault weapon, in effect as a sporting gun? Do you think that's appropriate in our country? Does it trouble you? What's your thought?
Yeah, it's designed to be a weapon of war. And, part of it comes from the capacity of the magazine, but part of it is just the lethality of the projectile. It was designed for a lightweight projectile to tumble when it hit its target and cause more damage that way. And so that's why when people describe it as a weapon of war, it is. It's precisely what it is. And I can understand gun collectors with special permits, who are responsible users, want to have weapons like this. But we regulate all sorts of weapons, machine guns, automatic weapons, etc. And this seems to be in the category that ought to have more regulation, given the consistent damage that it does to innocents.
Thank you for speaking to that. And to ask you about the Special Operations Forces, you were in the Army side of that. One thing that I have noticed as somebody covering the wars, counterterrorism wars in recent years, is the way we've relied, maybe over-relied on our Special Operations Forces in exhausting deployments for them, and with the inevitable consequences, some degradation in the standards and behavior of those forces. Most notable case is that of Eddie Gallagher, who was sanctioned by the Navy SEALs, brought into disciplinary hearings that President Trump then intervened in the middle of. But without necessarily asking you to comment on the Eddie Gallagher case, what do you think about this problem that developed, if it was, of overuse of special operations and the way in which that did seem to degrade standards of behavior and performance?
Yeah, so, in the decade after 9/11, as Special Operations Forces became really central to our wars, or war with Al-Qaeda and Afghanistan and Iraq, we realized we didn't have enough. And so we doubled SOCOM's budget. Excuse me, we doubled the manpower, we tripled the budget, but we quadrupled the deployments. And that went on for a number of years. And, where they were doing a 1-to-1 ratio, out to combat for 3 to 6 months, depending on the unit, back, and then out again, and then doing that repeatedly for deployments that numbered very frequently in the double digits, 10 to 15 deployments in combat zones. And that takes a toll. It takes a toll on families, takes a toll on the individual operator. They were central to our strategy in a lot of ways. Modern counterinsurgency depended increasingly on special operations forces for raids, for working with tribal elements to deny rural areas, et cetera. But it comes at a cost, and you'll always have some bad apples and indiscipline problems. But I think there was a systemic issue, and our commanders really tried to address this, imposing proper discipline when, incidents occurred, but also setting up family programs and other things, and caring for our wounded operators to try to deal with the stresses of combat. But, it was imperfect. You can always do more.
So after 10 years as a Green Beret, you joined the CIA. You got some extraordinary stories of that time in your career. One thing that I found fascinating, Mike, is that you give a really glowing description of CIA Director William Casey, who is not often described in such flattering terms. And I wanted to ask you why it is that, as you look back, you admired in him, or maybe to put it differently, what it is as you look back that you admired in him.
Yeah, so he certainly was a complicated man, and had his challenges. And I generally follow the thinking of my former boss at the Pentagon and senior at CIA, Bob Gates, who thought that Casey really was focused on trying to defeat the Soviet Union, and thought that it was possible after a while. Didn't initially believe it, but came to believe that. And so I think he was a historic figure. I think he clearly made mistakes, for instance, on Iran-Contra. I was puzzled sometimes during my time at CIA that he wasn't as interested in some reforms or building a CIA for the future as much. He was so engaged in current operations. But on balance, I think he was a very important director at an important time. When I look at the history of CIA and the directors and what they achieved, it's hard to deny his achievements.
Thinking back on those Casey days, and as you say, Casey wanted to kill Russians. He wanted to win the Cold War. He wanted an end to Soviet domination around the world, and he fought the wars necessary to do that. Do you think that the agency has become more risk averse since then? And if the answer is yes, as I'm sure you think it is that a good thing?
So I think risk aversion, is somewhat of a function of the political climate. And when, sometimes you go too far, then you overcorrect. And so there's periods when, we're really on the strategic offensive, during the 1980s, during the 1950s, after 9/11. And then there's some, often followed by periods of retrenchment. And, so I think there's things that the current generation of officers can learn from previous periods of initiative and, as the Romans would say, fortune favoring the bold. But you also need to have very disciplined tradecraft and do what's feasible and not reckless. The history of covert action is you have some spectacular successes, really extraordinary ones. You have a lot of modest successes, and then you have some really spectacular failures, and the failures sometimes outnumber the successes. And so it's a difficult business or a risky business, but you can't win if you don't if you aren't bold.
So let's talk about one example of boldness, and that's Afghanistan and our program to help the Afghanistan Mujahideen who were fighting the Russians. Anybody who's seen the movie Charlie Wilson's War, although they may not know your name, they know your character. You're the smart guy. You're the whiz kid at CIA who figured out how to develop for the Mujahideen a winning strategy using Stingers, these shoulder-fired anti-aircraft missiles. And lo and behold, a couple of years later, the Soviet Union was out of Afghanistan, and a couple of years after that, there wasn't any more Soviet Union. It's quite a story. So I want you just to go to the heart of that and the moments at which you began to think, you know, we can do this differently, and rather than fighting for a draw, we can actually give these people the ability to win this war.
Sure. So I was very fortunate. At the time I was given the job, the agency's budget for this program had been quadrupled, largely by Congress and particularly by Congressman Charlie Wilson, who was on the House Defense Appropriations Subcommittee. You know, the agency had asked for a 10% increase in budget, and it got a 300%, which is not your everyday occurrence in government. And then I had two bosses, the chief of all of South Asia and the chief of the Near East and South Asia, who believed in me fairly early on and progressively as the strategy seemed to be working. So, you know, the first thing was, if we have quadrupled the resources, we ought to relook at our strategy and see what we could do. And then one thing led to another. A National Security Council directed review changed our objective with a lot of input from CIA, from just imposing costs on the Soviet occupation to driving them out to try to go for victory by all means available. That's where the title of my book comes from. And then as we did the calculations and saw that we were having great success and our surge was exceeding Gorbachev's surge in 1985, we added more and more to it, more sophisticated weapons, and then asked Congress to essentially double our budget again. So it went up by a factor of almost 12 within 12 months. So it was a big, big escalation in both scale and speed, as I talk about. And it kind of at each step of the way, I thought, what's necessary to make this work? In some cases, was winning arguments in Washington. In other cases, it was with our foreign partners to get the Saudis to match us again, dollar for dollar, as we did this big increase, to get the Pakistanis, the frontline state, to go along, to get the Chinese and Egyptians and others to go along, the British to start supplying more sophisticated Western weapons, and eventually the US. And so it took all those things. But within 12 months, I was convinced, I guess, early in that period that we had a shot at winning. And then by the end of that period, by the end of that year, I really thought we were going to win.
It's a heck of a story. I urge people to read it. So, suppose President Biden gave you a call after he gets back from Vilnius. He says, Mike, I was reading your book on a plane, and I want you to give me, one or two ideas to augment our strategy in Ukraine that can make this war more effective, so that we can end up with a kind of success that you experienced in Afghanistan. How would you answer that?
Yeah, so I think it comes down to, again, scale and speed and trying to achieve within a realm escalation dominance. And so what we haven't, again, I think the cluster munitions was a very good decision for two reasons. One, to give them more artillery, which is critical, but two, to help the counteroffensive break through Russian lines, which are, really dug in with minefields and artillery. And you got to get their heads down if you're going to break through. But there's other things we could be doing that we haven't decided to do. The so-called Army Tactical Missile System has a range of almost 200 miles. We haven't supplied that. We could. Longer range surveillance drones with weapons. We've considered that, haven't supplied that. That would let them see deeper into Russian territory. And then, the fighter aircraft, which are on the way, but I would be doing everything I could to speed that up in quantity. You have to have, we wouldn't fight without local air superiority. And, asking the Ukrainians to do an offensive against a dug-in an opponent like that is like asking him to fight 1918 style. So I would get them into the post-Desert Storm era, and then I think they'd have a great chance at taking their territory back.
And I have to ask you, as a former CIA case officer, tell us what you make of Yevgeny Prigozhin's, I'm going to use Putin's words here, armed mutiny. And the fact that he apparently is still in Russia. He's apparently, according to the Washington Post today, still talking to Putin. He's checking out his guns and money in St. Petersburg. What the heck is going on here? What's your take on this?
So it's a great question. So I think, they've lost across the board. It shows, Prigozhin has certainly lost some of his power, at least, and Putin has been shown to be weaker than many believed. I think the reason he's still around and they're having these meetings and negotiations is Putin knows he needs Prigozhin's troops. They've been kind of the shock troops of these mercenaries have been the shock troops of Russian operations since they, have concentrated on the East, and he still needs them. And my guess, my hunch, I don't know this, is that while they've pledged their loyalty to Putin, they've made it clear they're going to fight, as long as they're intact and maybe bad things don't happen to their boss. I'm sure Putin would like to kill Prigozhin, and he just doesn't think it's in his interest right now.
Fascinating answer. Best answer I've heard yet. So I want to close with a question from an audience member in Connecticut named Ramunas Bigelis, and forgive me if I mispronounced that, who asks, how has the Ukraine war redefined the strategies and roles of the CIA, which I take to mean what role is the CIA playing in Ukraine and what role might it play?
So had the Russians successfully taken Ukraine, where you had a resistance, then the president might have had a choice between a covert operation to support the Ukrainian resistance or overt military, and he might have gone the covert route as we did in Afghanistan. But given the Ukrainians held, this is really a conventional war that we're supporting. And so CIA's role, is more in the intelligence realm than the secret war realm. This is more of a DoD-led effort than CIA, though CIA has an important role to play. But all sorts of intelligence and and things you can do. One of the great strengths of CIA is a handful of people can make a difference sometimes. Going where others cannot go, and so I would expect that they're doing some of that too. But intelligence has been a very important source of advantage for the Ukrainians. A lot of it coming from open sources, the commercial satellite constellations and commercial drones, et cetera. But you still need someone to help fuse them and everything else.
So we've come to the bottom of the half hour. I want to again thank Mike Vickers for joining us today. The book, by all available means, is quite unusual and interesting. Mike, thank you for joining us.
Thank you, David. It's a great pleasure.
So we'll be back with lots more Washington Post Live programming. Please go online to WashingtonPostLive.com and look what we've got coming. Sign up for the things that interest you. Thank you for joining us today.